Joining me right now, John McLaughlin, former acting director of the CIA. John, with a welcome to you. We have the president saying that he can make a quick decision on the next FBI director. I want to get to that in 1 second. But on the question of tapes, sir, I mean, we just want to reiterate what we did last hour. If the president were to be making recordings in the White House, it's completely legal, correct? You can do that in the District of Columbia with just one person aware of those ongoing recordings, if they're even happening.
Well, Alex, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is it is legal, yes.
Okay.
It's within his rights.
So getting to the appointment of a new FBI director, the speed that the president has alluded to, how practical is that? Do you think a decision can be made properly in just a few days?
I think a decision can be made pretty quickly on this. The important thing is that he picks someone who is, without question, independent and full of integrity. One of the noteworthy things here is, I think, whatever one agrees with or disagrees with when it comes to Jim Comey, within the intelligence world, he was viewed as a person of integrity and absolute independence. You always knew that he would say what he thought. And if you're a worker bee somewhere in the intelligence world or in the FBI, you also knew that when you were engaged in some sensitive investigation or sensitive intelligence issue, that he'd provide you top cover. That is, he would be someone who wouldn't throw you under the bus. So those are the qualities the president has to look for in a new FBI director.
Sir, Attorney General Jeff Sessions seems to be the one who's leading the interview process in Washington today. What do you think of that, the optics of that, considering that his own meetings with the Russian envoy Sergei Kislyak that he failed to disclose during the confirmation hearings led to a problem, and ultimately his recusing himself from the investigation, and the involvement in the Comey firing? So is he the guy to be doing this?
Well, you know, the optics are not good when it comes to any aspect of this drama we've seen in the last week, so I'm not surprised that they're not sensitive to the optics. He may not be the right guy to do it, but he's probably the guy who, in terms of official position, ought to do it. The more important aspect of this, of course, is that the new director will have to be confirmed by the Senate. So frankly, I think that's where the really searching investigation will occur.
And I mean, talk about seasoning. You spent 32 years at the CIA. What do you think of the way Comey was fired and all these conflicting explanations that come from the White House and the president himself?
Well, you know, if you're in the intelligence world, as I was for that period of time, you would react to this with a mixture of, I think it's complicated, a mixture of anxiety and determination. You would resent the fact that a leader of the intelligence community was fired so summarily, particularly the FBI, given that he has a fixed term of 10 years. The president can fire him, of course, but it's extremely unusual. So you wouldn't like that. On the other hand, you would probably decide to do your job even more fiercely, if you will. When I was there, the attitude would have been, if you stick us in the eye, we're going to look even closer and even harder at what we're required to examine.
And what do you make of Mr. Trump's account of the dinner that he had with James Comey and his denial that he asked for Comey's loyalty?
Well, you know, when I heard that, I was speaking at the time with Andrea Mitchell, and I said, and I would say again, I want to hear Jim Comey's side of that question. I can't imagine, we now know that Comey was uncomfortable even going to a dinner like that. I know Jim Comey fairly well. He was the Deputy Attorney General when I was Deputy Director at CIA. So it sounds right to me that he would be uncomfortable in that situation. I don't think he would pledge loyalty because, frankly, you know, all of us who serve at that level pledge loyalty to the Constitution and to defend the interests of the United States. So that's a moot point. You know, the president, oddly, seems not to learn anything. I've been thinking about the broader implications of this whole mess. One of them is that the president seems unable to connect one thing to another. I mean, this controversy we're seeing this week is a direct result of the rather foolish tweet he made some weeks ago alleging that President Obama was bugging Trump Tower. That obliged Jim Comey at some point to say We have no evidence of that. That probably upset the president and probably reinforced his desire to fire Comey, and now his firing has led to all of this, including, of course, the reference to tapes. And anyone who's been in Washington for any period of time with their eyes open, has any history at all, knows any history, knows that you don't, the word tapes summons up a whole history that is generally not good. So the president just doesn't seem to have any capacity to, he's engaging really in, I think even his supporters, perhaps not the hardcore supporters, but certainly people in the Republican Party at leadership level must be rolling their eyes and saying, this is self-destructive behavior and we're getting tired of apologizing and trying to explain it.
Well, you are certainly, when you say not good history, you're obviously referring to Watergate there, not good. The New York Times, sir, is reporting that Mr. Trump is considering a broad shakeup of his team of surrogates. So if these were miscommunications merely, where do you think the blame lies? Ultimately, who is responsible for the mishandling of the rollout?
That's a really interesting question, and I think he's wrong to be thinking of his communications people. The problem begins with the president himself, and having been in and out of White Houses, many of them, worked for 7 presidents over the course of my career, I would put in a normal White House, which this perhaps is not, I'd put it on the Chief of Staff. The Chief of Staff is supposed to be the person in the White House who has 360-degree situational awareness, knows what's going on in Washington, in the Congress, knows the implications of things. So I suspect he's not really consulting his Chief of Staff. If he had gotten any 5 or 6 people, ranging from H.R. McMaster to others in the White House who have some sense of how the world works, in a room and said anything about tapes, they would have said, Mr. President, be careful what you say in public on that score. They probably would have cautioned him to roll this out in a very different way, to allow some time, to do some effort, to speak personally with Mr. Comey before he did it. So I think what's going on here is not centered in the communications staff. In a way, I feel sorry for them because clearly they've been cut out of some of the things that they've subsequently had to explain. The problem is somewhere else. It's either in the president's management of his White House or in the Chief of Staff's orchestration of all of this.
May I ask you one more question, sir? That being all that's been made about the Russian photographer who was let into the Oval Office, the American press was not allowed in. And he was described to the White House allegedly as Sergei Kislyak's official photographer. Unbeknownst to the White House, so they say, is that he was also serving as an official photographer for the Russian state news agency TASS, on which these photos appeared on Russian television. Does that concern you?
It does. Well, let's start. It concerns me on several levels. First, of course, the imagery was very bad for the president to be smoking and joking, seemingly, with these officials at a time when all of this controversy is swirling about Russia's role. Leave aside the issue of complicity or from the Trump campaign. The more important question in many respects is, how did the Russians get away with interfering with our election at all? So that is the bad imagery. But then secondly, one of the things the Russians do well is intelligence collection. And so anytime you're dealing with them officially, you want to be alert to the possibility that that's part of what they're doing. And I say that as someone who finds many Russian officials to be, on a personal level, quite congenial. And of course, the Russian people are a wonderful people with a rich culture and who happen to be suffering these days from not very good governance. But you always want to approach a meeting like that with caution. And I would also say, again, having been in and out of the Oval Office a number of times over the course of my career, I always found that someone was very careful about who was going in there Again, it would be the chief of staff or the immediate aides outside. It's not the most. It's not a place that many people enter casually, so they should have thought about that a little more deeply. Well,
and as I wrap this up, I'll just add that the White House says that the equipment that was carried by the photographer was screened and all that sort of thing, but then there are those in the intelligence community, sir, who would say, well, anything of a surveillance nature would not normally be brought in, and the kind of screening that would be offered at the White House may not pick up on something. Again, all big ifs, but just more to add to the concern.
Well, I would add that I'm confident that someone in the White House, the term we use is swept the room. They do that all the time for listening devices and so forth, and I'm confident that that material would have been examined. However, I'm also aware of the history. If you look back at the time, this goes back decades now, to around the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Russians actually planted in the office of the, or the home, the residence of the American ambassador to Russia, a wooden Great Seal of the United States, which also passed inspection, by the way, but which turned out to be a monitoring device based on a technology that we had not yet discovered. So let me just say it's an area where there cannot be an excess of caution.
All right. John McLaughlin, former acting director of the CIA, and the 32-year member of that organization. Thank you so much, sir, for your insights.
Thank you, Alex.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.